Welcome, everyone, to a very special interview that we have today with our friend Ajahn Cunda and mentor and his sister, Rabbi Mintz. And we thought they're a brother and sister to people who've given their lives to the religious vocation. And we thought a conversation between the two about those different journeys would be really, really fun. So, Rabbi Mintz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It is an honor to be with you three Ajahns.
Ajahn, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Ajahn.
Oh,
He
sure,
was easier to get.
It's an honor to be with you too, Ajahns, and my sister, the Rabbi.
So, Ajahn Cunda was raised in a warm and loving family in the northern suburbs of Chicago and moved to California in 1996. Ajahn Cunda moved to Abhayagiri Monastery, where we are right now, in late 2005, and after 2 years training as an Anagārika and Sāmaṇera, ordained as a Bhikkhu in 2008 under Luang Por Pasanno and Ajahn Amaro. He trained at Abhayagiri for 8.5 years. In 2014, Ajahn Cunda moved to Tisaraṇa in Canada to practice under the guidance of Luang Por Vīradhammo. In 2017, he began living in several Western monasteries. In 2021, Ajahn Cunda spent a year at the Pacific Hermitage, some of which was with us, and since April 2022 has returned to Abhayagiri indefinitely.
And Rabbi Sidney Mintz was ordained in 1997 by the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religions in New York City. She's the founder of the award-winning Late Shabbat Young Adult Program at Congregation Emmanuel, where she served as rabbi from her ordination in 1997 through to 2024. She became a senior rabbinic fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem after completing her fellowship in 2004. Sidney currently serves on the national board of Bin the Ark, a Jewish Partnership for Justice, and as a rabbinic scholar for American Jewish World Service. She's a graduate of Bin the Ark Sela Leadership Program and is a member of the U.S. State Department's Working Group on Religion and Social Justice. She led Team Emmanuel in the AIDS life cycle ride from San Francisco to Los Angeles and is an avid open ocean swimmer.
All right. Thank you for joining us again, Rabbi Mintz. So I wanted to start with a question, we're going to steer the questions to both of you, and either of you feel free to follow up with each other or whatever you would like best. But one of you remained with your childhood family faith, and the other changed their trajectory into Buddhist robes. And I'm curious, just how have those two trajectories, do you feel, shaped each of your personal journeys, kind of in terms of the spiritual path? And either one of you can start, because I don't know who to call on or to direct.
Sydney's older.
Sydney's older. Sydney, you have to go first.
Seniority.
Right, yes. And I'm the more reverent one, so I'll take that question. And it's funny because people often ask me when they learn about my trajectory and then that my brother is a Thai forest monk, they often ask, well, what was in the water? What was it that was going on in your family? And I think it's kind of a funny question because our paths really diverged so much and then have come back together in terms of our spiritual path. So yes, I grew up the same way that Cunda did, in a Reformed Jewish family in the suburbs of Chicago. And when I was growing up, there were no women rabbis, there were no gay rabbis. It didn't seem like an automatic path for me since I was really into being Jewish. But as time passed, women were ordained for the first time in 1973. And I was a little girl at that point. And then while I was in the seminary, it became kind of that I was on the edge of the first generation of rabbis who were ordained who were gay or lesbian. So, those were two big things in my life where if it had been just even a decade before, I would have been prevented from fulfilling my spiritual desires to lead the Jewish community. And I always felt called. And as a kid, I didn't know what the calling was, but I felt very much called to move more and more towards the center of Jewish tradition. I was really enthralled with Jewish teaching and the ritual, the ceremony, especially the parts of our calendar that are really different from the calendar that we all grew up in the United States, the Gregorian calendar. So things like Shabbat or Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, very much the connection to the lunar cycle that Judaism is about. So there were things when I was very young that captured my attention and made me very serious about learning more. in terms of being a rabbi. So by the time I was 9 or 10 years old, it was pretty clear to me that that's what I wanted to do, is that I wanted to become a rabbi.
And I remember when I was younger, and you were in, I'm not sure if it was in high school or I found them in college, but I found stacks of note cards you'd written of Hebrew. And so did you start studying, I can't remember, in high school, or was it like in terms of like formally studying the language, or was it in college?
Well, I would say you and I both had our auspicious starts together studying for my bat mitzvah and your bar mitzvah. So I'm like the only one here who actually was at your bar mitzvah, I would say.
Yeah.
Which is funny, because at one of Cunda's ordinations, when he was chanting so beautifully, I thought, wow, he did that better than his Haftorah when he was 13. This is the real deal.
That was a pretty good Haftorah. I don't know about that.
Not to compare religions. But yes, so I started studying Hebrew to become bat mitzvah, and then I continued in high school and in college.
But I remember the bit, I just saw, like, I remember stacks of these note cards. So I remember you really engaging with the language, much more so than...
I was a Hebrew nerd as a kid. So I was doing that myself in high school.
Well, this one, I don't know if you know, Ajahn Kovilo went to university as a monk, and he got into serious Pali study and Sanskrit. So he's also a language file.
Yeah.
And also speaks some Chinese.
Yeah. It's great how the language study can really take you deeper into text, which can take you deeper into practice. And it's just a love, like it provides a lot of joy for me. So I imagine it's maybe similar for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Ajahn Cunda, what about you in terms of did you see any of the seeds like Sydney did as a child? And then what made those seeds sprout in a kind of Buddhist direction?
Well, I think the Jewish seeds, or that was my spiritual seed. So if we had grown up without any kind of religious heritage, then I wouldn't have had probably a spiritual calling. I don't know, but I think the sense is that with Judaism, for me, it just didn't quite fit the same as it did for Sydney. And so I just didn't feel the same calling towards it or interest in it. But there was the seed planted within it of like, well, what is the meaning of life? What is the intention in life? And, what are we doing? And what is it about? Also community and just the things that Judaism really brings up in terms of a focus on this cultural upbringing and the sense of being part of an identity of a group. So I had those kind of seeds planted, but then I think for me that there was a little bit more of a spiritual interest that I had, and so just to be straightforward, it wasn't provided for me as far as I could tell from what I understood from Judaism, and so there was a sense of looking elsewhere in a way, and that started in high school. I didn't really feel any kind of change in Jewish identity, even I think in college, but the actual investigation of the spiritual side versus the cultural side of my upbringing started to change. And I think in high school I read Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, and then started learning a little bit of meditation, and then that's where it all began, and then followed through in college with Buddhist courses and an interest in Buddhist philosophy and the suttas and things like that, although it was mostly Mahayana that I was learning about these days. But yeah, it was, so I think that the Judaism seeded the spiritual interest, but then there was more of a trajectory of the spiritual and the calling or the interest of an understanding of mind and suffering and dukkha around what's actually happening in the mind, for meditation and practice.
I'm curious if each of you could speak about, because we might have some crossover viewers, like people who are maybe not so familiar with Buddhism or people who are not so familiar with Judaism. I'm curious if each of you, maybe starting with Ajahn Cunda, just speaking about what is the goal of the practice, and what are the methods of a practice to reach that goal. And similarly for Rabbi Mintz, like what is the goal of a Jewish life, and how do you go about effectuating that? So,
yeah, well, the Buddha, the Buddha started his life recognizing that he wasn't happy, he was suffering, and there, it's kind of like there's got to be more to it than this. And he was living a pretty good life. He wasn't stricken with poverty. He was in a very well-to-do home, and so that kind of search is propelled him. And similarly, I think for me, it was just kind of a fair amount of suffering on my own end. Just I think my family members would recognize that in me. It's just, wow, this is a sufferer. And that really propelled me forward, as well as just discovering Buddhism and the Buddha's teachings on really that there's an end to that suffering, and that is through the perfection of the sila and samadhi, the sense that through virtue and through really an understanding of mind and what causes our own suffering and how we cause our own suffering, that can be alleviated completely, so that at the end there is non-suffering, and there is also non-birth, so one doesn't take birth again, and enter into the sphere of suffering again. So that that goal is part of like the that sounded pretty good to me when I was young and learning about it, and but definitely tempering everything has been being a monk, and how difficult it really is to put that into practice. But the Buddha's sense was he wasn't just the only person who could realize enlightenment. It was that all that beings who took on his teachings, if they didn't have certain obstructions, would not necessarily in this particular life, but could realize the end of suffering in that way, enlightenment. So that is the goal of the spiritual life, whether one is a monastic or a layperson. It's still the sort of the trajectory that the Buddha is offering. He doesn't kind of see it as a difference, to say that lay people are spiritually inferior or anything like that. It's just that, no, we all have this same goal of trajectory towards realization and realizing the truth and enlightenment. So yeah, that's my own sense of the, more or less what the Buddha's teachings, and where he encourages his followers to move with a sort of goal, if you will, as you said. The goal is the end of suffering.
Thank you, Ajahn. And Rabbi Mintz, what is your take on the goal and practice of Judaism?
Well, I find it interesting when Cunda said that he was kind of a suffering kid or suffering presence, that we could identify that. But I also would agree that everybody's suffering. Everybody's suffering about or with or from something. So I would say that growing up with Cunda, I didn't think of you as suffering more than me. So you know what? You can't take that away from me, man. Don't take my suffering away from me. No. And I know it's Buddhist to suffer, but it's also very Jewish to suffer. So we've suffered, we have guilt, we have shame. And I think the spiritual path a lot for me is about acknowledging that that's not something that comes from the outside, but that a lot of that is self-inflicted, that the lens on our suffering, guilt, shame, or negative thoughts comes from us, not necessarily from the outside world. It comes from the inside out. And to think about the spiritual path and what's the point of Judaism, I have to acknowledge that the spiritual path is a deeply human path, and I don't feel that any one religion is superior or inferior. That everybody is, hopefully, when they really get into some self-exploration, understanding that we're not just physical beings. We're very spiritually connected to ourselves, to one another, and to the universe. Judaism looks at the suffering in the world and ourselves and says, we know it can and should and will be better. And so I would say the mission of the Jewish people is to make the world a better place. to alleviate suffering, to do mitzvot, or the things that we're commanded to do to alleviate suffering, whether it's poverty, hunger, homelessness, things that have been going on since humanity was created, pretty much at the hands of other human beings. But there's a sense in Judaism, something called le'or hagoyim, which means or is light. So being a light unto the nations. And again, it's not like the Jews are above, but that we share light, that all humanity shares light with one another, and that we could see that the work that we need to do on ourselves should be, I would say, an embodied spirituality. So for me, I love Judaism because it's an embodied spirituality. I get to go into the world and I can meditate, I can pray, but I can do acts of loving kindness. And that to me feels very much the way that I live as a Jew. Is, I look at other people and I don't see the other, I see myself, and I try, very hard, it's a challenge, to do right by each human being.
Thank you, Rabbi Mintz. And what would you say can you describe the concept of suffering and of God in Judaism a little more, like kind of flesh those two out? Because it does feel like, in terms of making the world or bringing light into the world or finding a wholeness there, I've certainly heard of the concept of kind of the world having been shattered into different fragments and this sense of bringing it back together. Would you speak at all to those two concepts?
What did you say? We had like 7 or 8 hours on the podcast?
Yeah, right, good. Maybe just God, just
okay. So let me just back up for a second, jokingly about how long, that we could go on in this. There's a great story about a follower who really wants to learn about Judaism and goes to 2 different rabbis right before Shabbat is about to start, and goes to one rabbi, Rabbi Shammai, and knocks on his door and says, "Teach me everything there is to know about Judaism," while standing on one foot. And Shammai slams the door in his face, and he goes down the street to Rabbi Hillel and knocks on the door and says the same thing. Rabbi Hillel, teach me everything there is to know about Judaism, while standing on one foot. And Rabbi Hillel looks at this follower and stands on one foot. And I imagine that he's in his bathrobe. He's about to take a shower to go to Shabbat. He's in a rush, but he stands and he looks at this guy and he says, "Do unto others only what you want to have done to you. The rest is commentary. Now go and study it. Shabbat shalom." So this idea of the golden rule. And so I don't talk that much about suffering. I think, suffering is a human condition, but I will say that, what you just referenced is something from the Kabbalistic, the Jewish mystical tradition, Lurianic Kabbalah, which talks about God as a force that was a part of the creation of the universe, and that in some way the energy from the divine energy was so great that it cracked apart or broke open creation. And so there was this shattering during creation, and that for the rest of the time that humanity is occupying this fragile planet, that we are supposed to be taking our time and weaving back the world by taking the shattered fragments and bringing them back to wholeness. And that's the way that we treat one another. That's the mitzvot that we do. That's the work that we do in the world, so that the world's a little less suffering and edgy and tormented for each person. It's not to avoid it or say it doesn't exist. There's a lot of suffering, a lot of grief in this world. How do we alleviate it? How do we become a part of the fabric that is goodness?
Thank you.
And maybe just taking that thread in Buddhism and your understanding, your own practice, how do you become a fabric of goodness, like in a Buddhist context or in a monastic context?
Yeah, it's interesting because it comes up a lot with people sometimes saying, like, what are monks doing? And like, what kind of activism do you do? And things like that. And I think the interesting aspect is our activism is much less usually outward. So it's more of a like an inward individual activism that I think does affect the world, but it's not necessarily seen. So basically, what we're trying to do as monks or any kind of Buddhist practitioners is decrease greed, hatred, and delusion in ourselves. Really, then we say, like, if someone was to ask us, well, what is that doing? What is you doing? Like, what acts are you actually doing to help other people? And I would say, well, I'm decreasing greed, hatred, and delusion within myself. And they might say, well, that's not enough, or that's not really, that's just for yourself. And I said, well, imagine if everybody on the planet had no greed, hatred, or delusion. Yeah, that would really be an incredible planet to live on. And just imagine if there's even one person who has no greed, hatred, or delusion in themselves, and how would that affect others? And so, we're going to have some visiting teachers here who seem to have, in certain ways, accomplished that. And it's so incredibly inspiring to be around those individuals, to know them, to even it's just life uplifting to know that there are beings like that. And also to know that there are, for us, people will sometimes say, oh, like, thank you for being a monk, or thank you for being a nun, or whatever it is. And it's that, because that's the, showing, in other words, kind of showing people that there's that possibility. And of course, as monastics, we focus more on renunciation. Our vows are a bit more on renunciation than necessarily just moral vows that are taken in Buddhism. And so we're also kind of letting go of those things of the world that are very much focused on as something that increases greed, hatred, and delusion. And so I think that as a form of kind of like how we are activists in the world, how we as monastics are engaging, it's really bringing that sense of helping the world in that way, but it's seen in a different context of, like, going out and doing things. And in the Mahayana tradition, there is a bit more of that. There's a bit more in Mahayana, where there is an expression of more of a traditional activism. And the Theravada kind of more is like, well, yeah, try to do it through your own self-introspection and understanding and realization of Nibbana, the focus, as I mentioned, on enlightenment, and that will help the world. So yeah, that's kind of, I think, a good way to explain things.
One thing I'm sort of picking up is, we run into this a lot, the kind of pressure to justify our spiritual lives by society's standards. And it's interesting because it is the stories we most easily reference, it, just like do unto others as you would want done to yourself, for example. It, it invokes a very, a narrative that almost anyone can relate to and get behind. And yet, deep in each of our traditions is a relationship to something which is much harder to articulate, which is the transcendent. And I find that articulation can fall by the wayside when you're trying to kind of speak into the modern, milieu. And yet, I think it's kind of what sustains most of us of the religious vocation in the roles we find ourselves in. So, Rabbi Mintz, like, what does that relationship to the transcendent mean to you, and how do you sustain that in terms of your own, contemplative periods of the day or your life? And do you find that there's an openness or a hunger for that relationship in your congregation or in the people you speak to these days?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking it. When I think about the difference between, like, a transcendent presence of the divine or an immanent presence of God in the world or divinity in the world, that gets me back a little bit to that idea of embodied Judaism. And, I don't know if either one of you have siblings, but there's nobody who can push your buttons more than the people in your family.
Yes.
Right? And for anybody who's, listening or watching today, and, I think that some of our most precious and important relationships and the learning that we can do is from our family of origin. So, I'll just take this example because it's a very personal. Then this is the first time that Ajahn Cunda and I have spoken publicly like this. It's something I've wanted to do for a long time. And I think that there was a little bit of a resistance, not because of the polarity of our religions or not understanding, but when Cunda made this choice to really take Buddhism seriously, there was just a natural feeling for me. And I'm sure that anybody who is in robes has a sense, like I had a feeling like he was leaving the family, leaving the fold, leaving the faith. And that was like a negative feeling for me because it was a feeling of loss and of grief. So I know that for being, a monk in robes, it's a complicated relationship with your family of origin. However, it's been a long time, and I've learned so much from Cunda and from his practice and from his teaching and from Buddhism. And I say that with great respect because earlier I felt, well, like, what is this like monastic life that's so separate from the world? And what is happening in the world today makes me feel more and more like the monastic life really is contributing so much to the world by just being in a place where you are reflective, meditating, treading lightly on the earth. There's so much I think that we can learn from one another's religions, and instead of there being this, these thick, dark walls or caves that we're in that are separate, this universal sense of the transcendence that each one of us is hopefully interested in or drawn to. And I'll say specifically for me, it's in nature. When I feel that the world is, or I'm suffering, or there is too much grief because of what it is that I am trying to accomplish as a rabbi, I go into nature. And, you're at Abhayagiri right now as we are doing this podcast. How beautiful just to wake up and to be in the presence of that transcendence, to me feels like a great gift. So I like to think of it as, the transcendence of being a part of nature, but also in my relationships with other human beings. So I hope that's it's kind of a long way of answering it, but also just that balance between transcendent and immanence when it comes to our relationship with spirituality.
Yeah. Rabbi Mintz, just in terms of people who can press my buttons more than anyone else, actually more than my actual brother. It's actually your actual brother. Press my button. JK. But actually, to Ajahn Cunda, I'm curious, Rabbi Mintz spoke a little bit about, aspects of Buddhist renunciation or this monastic path, which, maybe Judaism could, learn from or look to, or just emphasis in different religions. And I'm curious if you could speak to both sides of this, like what you feel like Buddhism, monasticism could learn from Judaism, and maybe what else, like other strengths that you feel like Buddhism might have that, people from a Jewish faith could emphasize, perhaps.
Wow. Well, one of the things that, and I mentioned just a little bit of this when I was growing up in a Jewish household, was that because there was meaning expressed in my life as a family member within a family that was Jewish, we would get together and we would have Shabbat every week, and oftentimes maybe the first 8 years of my life was living in my grandparents' home, and so my cousins would come over, and so that was just, it was just a weekly experience, and there was sort of a breaking bread with family. It wasn't just sort of a random coming together. It was a sort of a celebration of our cultural background with each other and our religious aspect, and actually remembering a whole history, being 20. How long would you say it is? 5,000 years, Sydney, the Jewish history,
give or take. 5,000 years.
Yeah. So there's a recognition of that, a recognition of the relationship with Israel and the Torah and really everything we were doing. And so I grew up with that. I was steeped in that. It wasn't an Orthodox. Didn't grow up in an Orthodox family, as you mentioned, but it was just part of our life, and so that was that really is something that I think can touch into my Buddhist life, because it's sometimes as a monk easy to forget what it is we're doing, because it becomes so natural and imbued with just like the daily schedule and our roles in the monastery and all kinds of things like that. But having this memory of growing up Jewish and having a relationship with my family in that way, and that really does and has helped me learn a lot about not only just encouraging me towards this sense of like also having the family as the Sangha, the group of monastics and lay people as well, but encourage me to kind of see sometimes from that lens, like, okay, yeah, like this is a group learning process. This is a cultural aspect that I've entered into with my monastic brothers and sisters and the laity. So that I think has been quite helpful for me. And I really don't know what my life would have been like if I didn't grow up Jewish and have that as a background. Even that kind of desire for harmony and wanting the family to get along, wanting people to be in harmony, and that camaraderie. So that, I mean, it might sound like that's obvious, but that I think was very important for me. The other big deal, or the big overlap between the two religions, is sila and morality. And so growing up Jewish, there's a lot of emphasis on kind of examining your life in terms of like, are you doing the best you can do, with like God as a witness, and a sense of like bringing yourself up higher, but also for the benefit of the community, for the benefit of others. And so that really overlaps with my Buddhist practice and what the teachings of the Buddhas of the past have encouraged over and over again, is that it's not just a mental aspect of how we engage with our spiritual life. It's a sense of like, what is the correct thing to be doing as a human being, towards others, towards, outwardly, how do we protect others through our own actions, whether it's by not lying or being appropriate sexually, or not killing, not stealing, all of these things. And the sense of growing up Jewish was that was very much kind of moved me into that in terms of my Buddhist life very easily. So those are things that were quite helpful. In terms of the opposite, you said, like, what can Judaism learn from Buddhism? I think that I think the cultivation of meditation has sort of come into quite a lot of interest in terms of the Jewish religion, and there's always been a meditative aspect. In fact, I think like one can think of, probably Sydney can talk about, like the conversation with God one has as being Jewish is similar to how we would think about meditation. But that, I think that aspect of really cultivating the mind is something that is very helpful to Judaism and people who are practicing or thinking about their lives.
On that point,
can I just want to jump in, because I do think that meditation, there's so much that has become popularized in terms of religious practice, and I think Buddhism especially. So I want to back up for a second and say that in the Torah, in the first book of the Torah, in Genesis, Isaac, who is Abraham's son, meditates, goes out into the wilderness and meditates. Lasuach is the word. Lasuach is the word to meditate, to introspect, and to pray. And so that was 4,000 years ago that people were going into the Jewish people were going into the wilderness and meditating, and not necessarily being in a group of people and praying together, but just as a kind of a solo meditation practice. So I love thinking about that, because it seems to me that everybody should meditate in some way. Everybody should have some peace, some quiet. And I'm a struggling meditator. If I get a good minute in a day, I congratulate myself. That's the beginning of it. So I think that is something in terms of the way that the world connects with or is detached from religious practice. Definitely there are people who are Buddhists in the world every day. You wouldn't know it. If you're monastic, if you are in robes, obviously people identify you as Buddhist. And it was funny because when I came to the monastery last week, I was so excited to talk to Cunda. I sent him an article about this television show, White Lotus, and the third season of White Lotus is in Thailand. It's about Thai forest Buddhism, and I was so excited. And then I was like, wait a minute, I can't talk to these guys. They're not up and already at the end of the season. They can read the articles about it, but like it's not. But what's interesting to me about it is this probably one of the most successful television series this season is about the intersection between what's going on in the world of materialism, capitalism, the despiritualization of humanity, and this interest, this motivation for us to somehow come up with an authentic way to practice the spiritual life. So I think because, as Jews, there's a lot of Jubus in the world. There's, a lot of Jews who practice Buddhism and Buddhists who come from Jewish backgrounds, very famous ones, in fact. And so I just think that that's so interesting because people are fascinated with Buddhism. And what I found is that more and more people, we have more and more people who are interested in Judaism. Interestingly, especially post October 7th, in the last year and a half, more and more people are either interested in choosing a Jewish path or they're coming more seriously to their Jewish identity and their Jewish practice because of a threat of anti-Semitism that is happening in the world.
Rabbi Mintz, you spoke about this, just that importance of that contemplative spirit and kind of that refuge of quiet in nature or in your, daily practice, however much you get. One thing I've felt that that Judaism has developed, which Buddhist communities are still really struggling to, is putting aside a day of a week for quiet and for rest. And, if people really just try to cut off their momentum and, just turn everything off, it just can be quite dry and they don't quite know what to do at the time. And, having to build a world around that day where it's held and honored. How have you advised your congregation to actually cultivate that day of rest? Do you have any kind of skillful means for us?
Mm-hmm. Thanks for asking that, because I think of Shabbat, or the Jewish Sabbath, as one of the greatest innovations in the world. Because 4,000 years ago, when there was this description of the creation of the world that is in the Bible, in the Jewish Torah, the understanding is that the world's created in 6 days, and then God rested on the seventh day. So if you think about it in terms of time, 1/7 of your life is supposed to be in self-reflection and nurturing, in resting your soul and your body. And so the way that I think about that is, as Ajahn Cunda said, we didn't grow up Orthodox, but we grew up with a reverence, a respect, a love of Shabbat because of making challah, because of lighting candles, because of coming together as a family. It's where, it's the first time I learned how to love Manischewitz wine, and I still love it. Just that, and the sensual pleasure of Shabbat is also a big deal. So what I try to share with people is that Shabbat, first of all, is not just for the Jewish people. Shabbat is for everybody. It's for all humanity who has any tension or stress or anxiety or suffering. That's every single human being. We're all experiencing that. And that if you don't take, whether it's every day, taking a period of time, or once a week in the Jewish calendar, then you're really missing out on that sense of replenishing yourself. So when people ask about, well, how do you do a Shabbat practice? Do you turn everything off for 25 hours? It's actually 25 hours. The Jews love Shabbat so much that it starts when the sun goes down and it doesn't end until there's 3 stars in the sky. So it's 25 hours of Shabbat. It's the longest day of the week. That you don't have to do it all at once. And I'm sure this, corresponds to your practice, which is you don't one day stop the rest of the world and immediately go into robes, right? Mm-hmm. You're a novice, you're an Anagārika. There's different levels of getting immersed in practice. So what I say to people is, don't think about it as something that's onerous or a burden. It's not what you're missing out on Shabbat. It's what you actually get to do with that time. Because Judaism is a religion, a practice, a spiritual path that really doesn't have to do with physical place. It has to do with sacred time. Because we've been living in the diaspora for the last 2,000 years. the first couple thousand years, we were trying to get into Israel, and we were out, and we were in, and we were out. Like, when Siddhartha lived the 5th century BCE, we were being taken away to Babylonia from the land of Canaan or Palestine or Israel. So we've been living nomadically for so many thousands of years that it's sacred time that we celebrate, so that you should be able to do Shabbat, those 25 hours, wherever you are in the world. You don't need a specific physical temple to celebrate. But I like to tell people, don't do all 25 hours at one time. Start with a couple of hours. Turn off your devices. Turn off your cell phone. And there's different ways for people. Some of my most intense meditation happens during challah making on Fridays, because it's a long process. You can't bake bread. It's just like, I think Cunda shared this with me. I hope it's not incorrect, but one of the Buddha's teachings is that you can't rush a wave up onto the shore. This idea of like time, and that there's something very sacred about the time that you take to enter Shabbat. So that making bread, if you've ever made bread, it takes a long time. And a lot of times you're doing it alone. So for me, there's something where I have to physically be active in order to really be successful meditating. For me, that's challah baking. So it's the process of preparation for the 25 hours, and then immersing yourself slowly but surely into have a meal with your family. If you don't know the Hebrew, say 3 blessings of gratitude on Saturday. They can be in any language. And have challah French toast the next morning. So there's the sensual pleasure. Shabbat is a time of love, of sensual pleasure, of tasting new things, but it's also a time so that you can live the other 6 days of the week and not be in so much pain and suffering.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm curious. Your sister, Rabbi Mintz, mentioned just that there are several or many kind of well-known Jubus, who are kind of crossing this. What might seem to some to be a divide. You mentioned, the early generation in the 1970s bringing Buddhism from Southeast Asia to America, Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, Jack Kornfield, were all, at least culturally Jewish. And I'm curious if you might be willing to speculate about why that is, because there are these seeming differences. You mentioned about, for Judaism, the joy of sensual pleasure on Shabbat. Whereas like Buddhism, we so much emphasize the joy of renunciation. And it seems like those two are contradictory. So where is the consilience? How might it be that there are so many Jubus disproportionately to the number of Buddhist and Buddhish people in America?
Well, I think didn't Sidney the Dalai Lama address that when with the Jew in the Lotus book, when he said something about dissatisfaction. He just said, "Oh, if there are Jews moving towards, I'm not sure I'm getting this right, but moving towards Buddhism, there's something they're wanting more of that Buddhism's offering, and so, but they're maintaining they're still maintaining their Judaism. So, what that is, I'm not necessarily sure if it's renunciation or mental cultivation. The Buddhist teachings are so directly, involved with, in a different way that I grew up learning about Judaism, really like, if this comes up in the mind, you do this. If that comes up in the mind, and you're always, it's a pretty strict guidance about how to maintain equilibrium within the mind. In terms of what the Dalai Lama was talking about in this conversation, I think he was saying if there's something that Judaism isn't offering Jewish people, that they're seeking these things in Buddhism, then it needs to figure out how to provide that for the people who want these things. My sense is that, as I was mentioning, that the Buddha has a very direct kind of sense of this is what's paramount and important. It's so important that you try to maintain a state of mind that is inclined towards wholesomeness and goodness, and to maintain a state of mind that has those qualities that are unwholesome as decreasing or preventing them from arising. And so, because it's just really focused on that so much, it doesn't emphasize a lot of the other things that we've been talking about with Judaism. And so that's maybe a missing piece, or it's just something that people are very attracted to. And I know that it's there. We talk about sila in Judaism, morality in Judaism. So that aspect of it is there. But in terms of mind cultivation, and the hindrances and like what the Buddha is really seeing as dangers and how we can alleviate suffering, that's a pretty specific to Buddhism teaching and framework. And so it's just like almost like he's really like kind of pushing people in that direction much more so than in other directions, especially ritual or things there where people are bound up with their cultures in certain ways. And he was trying to really go against that. In many ways, he saw that as obstruction. So I think there is some attraction to that. But at the same time, when we say Jubus, there are people, as I would sense, Sydney, that just they, love their Jewish religion and they want to practice in their Jewish religion and be Jewish, but they have this attraction towards what the Buddha is teaching as well. So they're maintaining being both, both things.
That's, it's a perspective to think about. There's the numbers. So there's probably, somewhere around 7% of the world is Buddhist, and somewhere around 0.2% of the world is Jewish. Mm-hmm. So I'm not talking just the numbers game, but when you think about how tiny the Jewish tribe is in terms of the world population, and how I believe that anti-Semitism has really, in a negative way, made a lot of Jews feel that assimilation or practicing other religions is a safety in some ways. And on the other hand, the positive part is that I think that there's a lot of Jewish and Buddhist practices that are aligned with one another, and the Jews learn a lot from Buddhists, and Buddhists learn a lot from Jews. Today we're recording this on a Jewish observance day called Yom HaShoah, which is the observance of the Holocaust, the day where you observe the Holocaust that happened to the Jewish people, of a third of our people being murdered by the Nazis in World War II. And not to be a bummer on the podcast, but to think about, even when people say, it's unfortunate because people think, well, I'm not Jewish enough. Are you Jewish? Or even the word culturally Jewish. When people say, well, I'm culturally Jewish, I usually say to them, just to unpack that, well, you're Jewish. Oh, I'm culturally Jewish. And I say, well, you're just Jewish. What does it actually mean to be culturally Jewish? They're saying, I'm not really Jewish. I'm not really practicing Judaism. Like, imagine as Buddhist practitioners, if you said, I'm just culturally Buddhist. No, I've never heard of that. I've never heard anybody who's practicing Buddhism to say, I'm just culturally Buddhist. I'm not really. So I like to invite that introspection about, like, what does it mean to just be culturally something that's a spiritual path for you?
What is, in terms of today being this observation of the Holocaust, like, how do you, tragedy is, striking the Jewish community now as well. There's a huge amount of turmoil around the world. And how do you advise people to keep their hearts centered in the midst of all that? Like, where is refuge when that's kind of swirling around within your community?
It's not easy. Every minority community has suffered at some point along the timeline of history. And a lot of times it's been the Jewish people over the last 4,000 years. But we see suffering all the time in communities, and when people are hated and people are hateful. So I think that the Jews have shown they're a pretty resilient people. And the fact that we're still around after all these years, to me, sometimes seems miraculous in terms of being such a tiny tribe. When I ask people, around me or where I live, like, well, how many Jews do you think there are in the world? It cracks me up because people will be like, oh, like 25% of the people in the United States, 45% of the people, 15% of the people in the United States are Jewish. It's like less than 2% of the people in the United States are Jewish. So when I think about anti-Semitism, or I think about, I think sometimes that being hated or being maligned can actually create resilience in individuals, and definitely in a community of faith. Because you have to come together and you have to figure out ways not to be exclusive or exclusionary to other people. What we're doing today is really to give people a little bit of a taste of Buddhism, a little bit of a taste of Judaism. Here's these two kids who grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. One became an Ajahn and one became a rabbi. I think we should have our own podcast, by the way, just so you know.
I would support
at some point. But I do think that that level of suffering that comes as a result of being a minority community. I mean, we see it today, especially in the United States, with what's going on, and I envy those people who are not reading, like the New York Times every day, or watching things that are so disturbing or distressing about the way that minorities in this country are being treated. But what I think is when you see other people being treated in a way that you don't want to be treated yourself, getting back to that story of the golden rule, that it is incumbent upon us, no matter what religion you are, no matter what gender you are, what color you are, to reach out of yourself and to alleviate that suffering. So it's, I think that those of us on a spiritual path maybe can see our responsibility a little bit more than just saying, well, that's terrible. I hope that doesn't happen to me.
Rabbi Mintz and Ajahn, just curious, I know we're coming up on your time, but just curious if both of you would be willing to if there's anything else you'd like to add to this conversation, maybe starting with yourself, Rabbi Mintz, and then coming to Ajahn Mintz. And just what else would you like to add to this conversation? What would you like to say to Buddhists or people who are interested in Buddhism, or to this connection between the two faiths?
I guess I would just pull out one of my favorite texts from the Mishnah, from one of the Jewish legal texts in Pirkei Avot. It says, the whole world is a very narrow bridge. The most important thing is not to be afraid. And the actual Hebrew says the most important thing is not to make oneself afraid. And I'd like to end with that, because I think that the spiritual path is not short. Relationships with our own family of origin, brothers and sisters, is not short. The three of you are brothers in your spiritual path now. It's not a short relationship. It's hopefully a lifelong relationship. And the most important thing, living in a world that is precarious and full of suffering and where there's so much unknown, is not to make oneself afraid, because what it does is it breeds that and breathes life into fear. And I'm somebody who chooses a lot of the time not to live in fear as much as I possibly can. And I think when you don't live in fear, you can be more open-hearted to other people.
Thank you, Rabbi. Ajahn.
And we live at Fearless Mountain. So that's a good. That's also a good thing. So Abhayagiri is Baya is fear. Is that the best translation? And is negation. So it's fearless. And we live in Fearless Mountain. And I think for myself, I don't know how often people relate to this, but just thinking about that and providing a sense of fearlessness. For me, one of the reasons that I wanted to become Buddhist was that the Buddhism for me was answering more around a sense of fear of death. And I was very afraid of that, just my life ending and no longer existing. And the Buddha really kind of pretty much said, if you practice what I'm teaching you, that will be alleviated. But he also, interestingly enough, talked in a similar way to what Sydney was saying, and that is that by doing our practice as Buddhists, we're providing fearlessness for others, and it's not just for ourselves, but we're actually giving others the gift of fearlessness around us. So and in Judaism is providing that in certain ways too, as you have people who are living with a sense of morality and care about how they behave and looking after neighbors and all these things. This is what provides fearlessness. If you're around somebody who, in Judaism, there is the same, precept around lying. You're around somebody who doesn't lie, you don't feel afraid of them in any way, or somebody who doesn't kill you or try to kill others. So that's a big crossover with both of us, as I've mentioned several times in the interview. But I think that identifying these commonalities, but also as Sydney was mentioning, like there is strength in having a recognition of other paths, and like the advantages to some of the things that one path teaches and another does or doesn't teach, and actually seeing that there is like, okay, we don't have to necessarily isolate ourselves into saying like, oh, well, Buddhist practice means I can't be Jewish or something like that. So I think that it's really important to kind of really recognize, what is it that we are seeing good in all of the religions that are represented, and what is it that's benefiting us, that we truly have a sense like, okay, that is beneficial for me. I'm not trying to suggest like an eclectic, like take everything from each religion and come up with your own. I'm just more saying that we can see that there's goodness in each religion, and in terms of Buddhism, it's really this sense of like looking within yourself and really trying to understand, how am I causing suffering for myself? How am I causing suffering for others? And how can I alleviate that? And then to know like, well, you can't just make yourself not suffer. You have to recognize, realize, and understand like what is actually happening. And that comes with Sydney, you mentioned the word embodiment, and that's something that is emphasized so much, and with a lot of our sort of Western teachers in our Sangha, like really coming back to our body as the present experience is what's going to teach us, because our minds want to go outward and see like, okay, I can fix that or fix this, and it's like one of the last things we want to do is recognize sort of our light within, sort of to recognize what's actually happening here. And that's, I think, one of the benefits that the Buddha kept teaching about is like, no, just keep coming back to this over and over again, because the confusion is the signaling is always, it's out there, it's fix this, do that, become this, and he just keeps saying, nope, just kind of ignore all that signaling and just keep coming back to like what is present right here, and how can you understand your own suffering based on that. So yeah, I think that that's a universal approach to understanding our own goals, or understand our sense of like what is really important to us. Because I think most human beings wouldn't argue that suffering or discontent or a sense this isn't right, I don't like it, I don't want this, it's not pleasant for us. We don't find it as something inviting or we want to really engage with. We or not engage with, but it's not comfortable. It's not something that in our mind we feel like, yeah, I really want to complain as much as possible because it makes me feel so great. And so once we identify like how to extricate ourselves from that, there's so much freedom and happiness involved. And so I don't think that's necessarily a Buddhist thing. I think that's a everything for everybody thing that the Buddha was teaching about.
Rabbi Mintz, before we wrap up, do you have one Ajahn Cunda story for us?
Oh, no. Well, I'm glad this is not live.
You can edit this out. I'm going to end with two things. One is nobody in our family liked cats. And I will just tell you that I came home from like some trip from summer camp and there were 3 cats living at my house. And so what he did to you guys, he did to us. We ended up with cats in our house. So he's I appreciate Cunda's love of animals. What I would say, do you guys mind if I end with a joke?
Yeah, no, please.
Okay, because I think also like joy and laughter is so much an important part of our spiritual life. And so this is a story I often tell about a Jewish mother who's a little bit elderly, who is going to visit her guru. And she decides that she is going to make this trek from New York City, and she gets on a plane and she goes all the way to Kathmandu, and she is brought up this mountaintop by a Sherpa, and she gets to the top of the mountaintop, and there is a line of people waiting to speak to the guru. And this Jewish mother waits in line for 17 hours. And when she gets to the front of the line, the assistant to the guru, who is sitting there, he's under a canopy, he's wearing a loincloth, sitting in the lotus position, he's gaunt. And the Jewish mother finally gets to the front of the line, and the attendant says to her, "You're only allowed to say 3 words to the guru." She says she understands, and she gets up and she looks down at the guru and she says these 3 words. She says, "Sherman, come home."
I like that.
So I think about that as a funny joke about Jews and about the practice of being in robes, but I also think that the reason we laugh about it is we're a little uncomfortable because Sherman's already home. And there you have it.
Nice.
We're all just trying to find our way home.
Well said. Well said. Yeah.
It's been an honor to be in conversation with the 3 of you.
Rabbi Mintz, we really appreciate getting to meet the legendary sister of legendary Ajahn Cunda. We one of our kind of dearest brothers, and we hope to get to meet you in person soon. So
I hope so.
yeah.
Okay. Well, take care. Thank you, Ajahn.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sydney. Thank you for joining us, and thank you all for thank the 2 of you for bringing us together. Very sweet. So we'll have to do it again.